She'll never make that shot. Colonel Jack Mercer grabbed Sarah Mitchell's rifle right out of her hands, the rifle her dead father gave her, and slammed the stock down onto the concrete so hard the scope cracked. Then he kicked it, skidding across the wet pavement toward her boots. "Pick it up," he sneered, "and go home." 41 elite operators laughed. Sarah Mitchell, decorated Army combat sniper, looked down at her broken rifle, then back at the colonel, and she smiled. Because in 11 days on a target no human had touched, in 30 years she was going to make him eat every single word. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If this story moves you even a little, please subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one earns its ending. And do me a small favor. Drop a comment and tell me the city you're watching from right now, because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. So tell me where you are. Now let's get into it. The pages were still lying on the ground when the first drops of California rain began to dot them, and not one of the 41 men standing in formation moved to help her gather them. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. Not the colonel's voice, not the laughter. The stillness of 41 men who had already decided what she was before she'd spoken a word. She crouched calm as Sunday morning and began collecting the scattered sheets one at a time. Her medical clearance, her marksmanship history, her combat record from a valley in a country most of these boys had only read about. She stacked them square against her knee, tapped the edges even, and stood back up. When she looked at Mercer again, there was nothing on her face. No anger, no tears, no plea. And that absence of reaction seemed to bother him more than any outburst could have. "You think silence makes you tough," Mercer said, stepping closer. He was a big man, gray at his temples, a voice that had spent 30 years giving orders that got obeyed without question. "I've watched men twice your size wash out of this course in tears. You know why? Because this program doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care what you survived. It cares about one thing. Can you make the shot when the whole world is falling apart around you? And I already know the answer for you." "Then you've got nothing to worry about, sir," Sarah said. A few of the men exchanged glances. It was the first time anyone had heard her speak, and her voice wasn't shaking. It wasn't loud either. It was just steady, the way a person sounds when they've already accepted that the next 6 weeks were going to be a war, and they'd made peace with the cost. Mercer's jaw tightened. He turned to the formation. "This is the Joint Special Operations Sniper Qualification, the hardest sniper course in the United States military. Some of you are SEALs, some of you are Rangers, some of you are Recon Marines. You are the best your branches have to offer, and most of you will still fail." He let that hang. Then he gestured at Sarah without looking at her. "And one of you the Army decided to send as a political experiment. Don't let her slow you down. Don't let her distract you. And when she quits, and she will quit, don't waste a single ounce of pity on her. Pity has killed more soldiers than bullets ever have." He dismissed them. The formation broke, and as the men filed toward the barracks, Sarah heard the muttering start the way it always started, low and ugly, and just loud enough to be meant for her ears. 2 weeks tops. Affirmative action with a rifle. My sister could outshoot her, and she sells real estate. Sarah walked to the barracks with her file tucked under her arm and her chin level, and she didn't answer any of it, because she had learned a long time ago in a place far hotter and far more dangerous than Coronado that the men who talked the most were almost never the ones you needed to worry about. The dangerous ones were quiet. The dangerous ones watched. And right now, the most dangerous man on this base was a colonel who just told 41 witnesses exactly how this was going to end. That first night, Sarah lay in the bunk. They'd given her a partitioned corner of the barracks behind a hung sheet, because there were no separate quarters for a woman in a program that had never had one. She could hear them on the other side, the easy laughter of men who belonged, who'd been told their whole lives that they belonged. She pulled out a worn photograph from her breast pocket, the edges soft from handling, and she looked at the man in it, her father, standing in front of a Montana barn in a sweat-stained shirt, a hunting rifle broken open over his forearm, squinting into a sun that had been setting on that same horizon for 60 years. "You'd have laughed at all this, Daddy," she whispered. "You'd have laughed and told me to stop wasting good light." He'd been the one who put a rifle in her hands when she was 9 years old. Not a toy, a real one, heavy and serious, and he'd told her something that morning she had carried into every dangerous place she'd ever stood since. "The wind doesn't care who you are, Sarah. The wind doesn't care if you're scared or proud or angry. The wind only cares whether you understand it. Learn the wind and the wind will carry your bullet home. He'd been gone 2 years now, a heart that just stopped one ordinary Tuesday afternoon while he was fixing a fence. She hadn't made it home in time. That was a wound that didn't close, the kind you just learned to carry. And tonight, lying behind a bedsheet in a barracks full of men who hated her, she carried it the same way she always did, quietly. The next morning at 0400, the course began for real, and Sarah understood within the first hour that the colonel had not been making an idle threat. He'd been making a plan. The morning run was supposed to be 8 miles. Sarah ran it. But when the formation peeled off toward the chow hall, an instructor named Sergeant Doyle stepped in front of her with a clipboard and a flat expression. "Mitchell, Colonel wants your route extended. 2 additional miles. Solo. Now." She didn't argue. She turned and ran the extra 2 miles alone on legs that were already burning while the rest of the class ate breakfast. By the time she got back, the food was cold and the line was closed. She ate a protein bar standing up against a wall and was at the rifle range 2 minutes before the class started. That was day 1. By the end of the first week, a pattern had formed so obvious that even the men who hated her had started to notice it. When the class shot in the morning with clean light and calm air. Sarah shot in the afternoon when the heat distortion was at its worst. When the class got 2 attempts at a stage, Sarah got 1. When another candidate flubbed a shot, the instructor would say, "Shake it off, reset." When Sarah flubbed 1, Doyle wrote it down in red ink and underlined it. There was a ranger in the class, a quiet kid from Georgia named Tyler Brooks, 26 years old, who watched all of this happen for 5 straight days and finally couldn't keep his mouth shut. He caught up to Sarah as she was cleaning her rifle alone in the equipment bay one evening long after the others had gone. "Ma'am," he started. "Don't call me ma'am. We're the same rank near enough. Sarah's fine." "Sarah." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "What they're doing to you. The extra routes, the afternoon shooting slots, the way Doyle scores your card. That's not right. I've been keeping count. You're shooting harder conditions than any of us, and your numbers are still top 3. If they scored you the way they score me, you'd be number 1, and it wouldn't even be close." Sarah kept cleaning. She ran the bore brush through the barrel slow and even. "I know," she said. "You know, and you're not going to say anything." "Say it to who, Brooke?" She finally looked up at him. "And to the colonel. He's the one writing the scores. To the brass. They're the ones who handed him a woman to break, so the program looks like it tried. There's nobody to complain to. There's just the work." She set the brush down. "Besides, you think I came all the way out here to win a fair fight? I came to win the unfair one. That's the only kind anybody's ever offered me." Brooks didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there a moment, then nodded slowly, like something had rearranged itself in his head. "You shoot like you've been doing it your whole life," he said. "I have." A small, tired smile. "Since I was 9. My daddy taught me. He used to say the rifle doesn't lie. People lie. Scorecards lie. The wind doesn't lie. The bullet doesn't lie. Whatever you put in is what comes out the other end." She slid the bolt home with a clean metallic snap. "You've got good hands, Brooks, but your problem's not your hands." He blinked. "What's my problem?" "You shoot scared. Every time you settle behind that rifle, somewhere in your head, there's a voice telling you you're about to miss. And the second you believe it, you flinch, and then you do miss, and then the voice gets louder. I've been watching you all week." She stood, slung her rifle, and headed for the door. Then she stopped. "The shot's already made before you pull the trigger, Brooks. You make it up here." She tapped her temple. "Fix that, and your hands will follow." She left him standing in the equipment bay, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Coronado, Sarah Mitchell had said more than 10 words to another human being on that base. The thing about Mercer's campaign against her was that it was working, just not the way he intended. Every unfair route she ran built her legs into iron. Every brutal afternoon shooting slot taught her to read heat shimmer the rest of the class never had to fight. Every red mark on her card just made her more precise because she had no margin, none at all. And a person with no margin learns to be perfect. By the start of the second week, the men had stopped saying 2 weeks tops. They'd stopped saying much of anything about her at all. Because you can't easily mock someone who's quietly out shooting you in worse conditions while getting half your attempts. But Mercer saw it too, and it didn't soften him. It did the opposite. Sarah was crossing the compound one evening when she passed the colonel's office, and through the half-open door she heard her name. She shouldn't have stopped. She stopped. I don't care what her numbers say. Mercer's voice low and hard. She does not graduate this course. Are we clear, Sergeant? I will not have it on my record that this program handed a qualification to a woman so the Pentagon could put out a press release. Find me something. Find me a stage she can't pass, and if you can't find one, build one. A pause. Then Doyle's voice careful. Sir, with respect, her marksmanship is genuinely exceptional. If she completes the final phase, the numbers are going to speak for themselves. There won't be a clean way to fail her. Then we go to Nevada early, Mercer said. We give her Echo 7. The silence after that was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Sir, Doyle said finally, and there was something different in his voice now, something almost like fear. No one's hit Echo 7 in 30 years. Not one shooter, not one. You put her on that target, she's going to fail, just like every elite operator who ever stood on that line. But sir, so will every other candidate. That's not a fair washout. That's a target nobody can hit. Exactly, Mercer said softly. And when she misses it, it won't be discrimination. It'll just be the standard. The same impossible standard every man on that line faces. And nobody, not the Pentagon, not the press, not her, will be able to say a word. A chair creaked. Some standards exist for a reason, Sergeant. I told her that the first day. I meant it. Sarah stepped back from the door, silent on the balls of her feet, the way her father had taught her to move through the woods, and she walked away into the dark without a sound. She didn't feel anger. That surprised her. She'd expected anger. Instead, she felt something colder and clearer. The feeling she got right before a long shot when the whole world narrowed down to one small, bright point of total focus. Echo 7. She didn't know what it was yet. But she knew this. A man had just told her, without meaning to, exactly how he intended to destroy her. And in Sarah Mitchell's entire life, the most dangerous gift anyone had ever handed her was the truth about what was coming. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay behind her bedsheet, and she thought about her father standing in front of that barn, breaking open his rifle, squinting into the Montana sun. The wind only cares whether you understand it. And she thought about a target nobody had touched in 30 years, sitting somewhere out in the Nevada desert waiting, and she felt the corner of her mouth lift in the dark. Because Colonel Jack Mercer had made one mistake. He thought he was setting a trap she couldn't escape. He didn't understand that he'd just told a sniper the location of the most important target of her life, weeks before she had to take the shot. And he'd given her something no other candidate in 30 years had ever had. Time to study it. In the morning, the men assembled in formation, and Mercer stood before them with that same cold smile, and he said the words that would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. Pack your gear. We're going to Nevada early. His eyes found Sarah's across the formation and held them. There's a target out there I want you all to meet, and I promise you by the time we're done, you're going to understand exactly what the word impossible means. Sarah met his gaze and held it level and calm, and she didn't blink. Because for the first time in 6 weeks, she wasn't worried. She was ready. And somewhere in the back of the formation, Ranger Tyler Brooks watched the colonel stare down, the only person in this entire program who'd bothered to look at him like a soldier instead of a problem. And Brooks made a decision of his own. He didn't know yet what it would cost him, but he'd watched them try to break her for 6 weeks, and instead of breaking, she'd taught a scared kid from Georgia how to believe in his own hands again. So whatever was waiting out there in that desert, whatever Echo 7 was, Brooks decided he was going to be standing on her side of the line when she faced it. The trucks rolled out of Coronado at dawn, 41 candidates and one woman heading east into the rising sun toward a target that had humbled the best shooters America ever produced. Sarah sat in the back of the lead truck with her rifle case across her knees and her father's photograph in her breast pocket. And she watched the California coast disappear behind them and the desert rise up ahead, vast and brown and ancient, and she thought about the wind. She thought about the wind the whole way there. The Nevada desert swallowed the convoy whole by mid-afternoon, and the moment the trucks rolled to a stop inside the classified training complex, Sarah Mitchell understood that whatever Mercer had planned for her was bigger than anything that had happened at Coronado. The men climbed down stiff and quiet, and the heat hit them like a wall, dry and merciless, the kind of heat that made the air itself shimmer and lie. Sarah stepped down last, her rifle case in one hand, and she felt 41 pairs of eyes flick toward her and then away. Something had shifted in the last day of driving. The men weren't laughing at her anymore. They were watching her the way you watch someone walking toward a cliff in the dark. Sergeant Doyle assembled them at the edge of a wide canyon, and Colonel Mercer walked to the front with a pair of binoculars hanging from his neck, and that same cold smile he had worn since the first morning. He let the silence stretch. He was good at that, Sarah had learned. He understood that silence frightened men more than shouting ever could. Across this canyon, Mercer said finally, 1,500 meters out there is a steel target. Some of you may have heard of it. Most of you haven't, because the men who faced it don't much like to talk about it afterward. He raised the binoculars and pointed. Echo 7. A murmur went through the formation. Sarah didn't move. She kept her eyes on the far canyon wall, searching the haze, and after a moment she found it. A small, dark rectangle, barely a smudge against the rock so far away it didn't even look real. For 30 years, Mercer continued, this program has sent its best shooters to that firing line. SEALs, Delta, Recon, men with confirmed kills past 2,000 meters in combat. Men whose names are written in the history of this craft. He lowered the binoculars and turned to face them. Not one of them has ever hit Echo 7. Not one. In 30 years, that target has never once been touched. He let that land. They call it the impossible shot, he said. And in 3 days, every one of you is going to stand on that line and take your turn. You'll all miss. That's not an insult. That's mathematics. The canyon does things to a bullet that no man can predict. The thermals come up off that rock floor in waves you can't see and can't time. The wind funnels through there like it's got a mind of its own. He smiled. Some standards exist for a reason. This is the standard. And some things, no matter how badly you want them, are simply beyond you. And then slowly, deliberately, Mercer turned his head and looked directly at Sarah Mitchell. Especially, he said, not today. The men shifted. A few of them glanced at her, expecting her to flinch, to look away, to show some crack in the armor. Most of them read the colonel's words as one more cruelty, one more dig, at the woman he'd been trying to break for 6 weeks. But Sarah didn't read it that way at all. She heard something underneath the insult, something Mercer didn't know he was giving away. He was too confident. A man that certain wasn't bluffing. Echo 7 was real, and it was exactly as deadly as he said, which meant the only way through it was to understand it better than 30 years of men who treated it like a coin flip. She wasn't going to gamble. She was going to learn. Dismissed, Mercer barked. Rest up. You'll need it. The formation broke, and the men drifted toward the bunkhouse, muttering among themselves. And Sarah heard the fear in their voices. Now real fear, the kind that came from being told you were about to fail at something in front of everyone you respected. Tyler Brooks fell into step beside her as she walked. 1,500 meters across a canyon full of thermals, he said quietly. Sarah, I've never even attempted a shot like that. None of us have. That's not a sniper qualification, that's a magic trick. It's not magic. She said it flat and certain. 30 years and nobody's hit it. 30 years and nobody's understood it. She stopped walking and looked at him. Brooks, let me ask you something. Every one of those men who failed, how long do you think they studied that canyon before they took their shot? Brooks frowned. I don't know. They show up, they get a briefing, they take their attempts. A day maybe. A day. Sarah nodded slowly. They treated it like a target. It's not a target, it's a system. And nobody beats a system they spent a day looking at. She started walking again. Get some rest, Brooks, and keep your head down around the colonel. Something tells me the next few days are going to get ugly before they get better. That evening, while the rest of the candidates collapsed onto their bunks, exhausted and demoralized, Sarah Mitchell waited until the sun dropped low and the camp went quiet. Then she slipped out the back of the bunk with a notebook, a pencil, and a small spotting scope, and she climbed the canyon ridge alone. She found a flat outcrop with a clear view across the gap settled onto her belly, the way her father had taught her 30 years before behind that Montana barn, and she put her eye to the scope. And then she did the one thing that no shooter in 30 years had ever bothered to do. She did nothing but watch. She watched the dust. There was a fine layer of it on the canyon floor, and the way it lifted and drifted told her where the air was moving. She watched the heat shimmer rising off the rock, how it bent and twisted the image in her scope, how it pulsed. She watched a hawk that came to hunt the canyon at dusk, the way it set its wings and rode the currents without a single flap. Because a hawk doesn't fight the wind, a hawk reads it. And where that hawk rose and where it sank told her exactly where the air was lifting and where it was falling. And after an hour lying still on that cold rock, Sarah Mitchell began to see something that made her breath catch. The thermals weren't random. She'd been told they were. Mercer had said it. Doyle had said it. 30 years of failed snipers had believed it. The canyon does things to a bullet that no man can predict. But that was wrong. It was so completely wrong that she almost laughed out loud on the ridge. The thermals followed a cycle. The heat came up off the canyon floor, built into a rising column, pushed the crosswind up and out of the bullet's path, and then collapsed, and the wind dropped back down, and the whole thing started over again. It was a rhythm, a pulse, like a heartbeat, and for a window of maybe 4 or 5 seconds, at the bottom of each cycle, the air across that canyon went almost perfectly still. 4 or 5 seconds. Once every few minutes. A door that opened and closed in the wind, and if you knew when it was coming, if you could feel the rhythm and wait for it, you could put a bullet through that door and across 1,500 meters of dead calm air in dead center, into a target that 30 years of men had sworn was impossible. It wasn't impossible. It had never been impossible. It had just never been understood because no one had ever cared enough about the people they were testing to spend more than a day looking. Sarah lay on that ridge for 3 hours. She timed the cycles with her watch and wrote everyone in her notebook. She wanted to be sure. She wanted to be so sure that when she stood on that line in 3 days with Mercer watching and 41 men holding their breath, there would be no part of her that doubted. By the time she climbed down in the dark, her hands stiff with cold, her notebook held the secret of a target that had defeated America's finest for 3 decades. She didn't tell anyone, not yet, not even Brooks. But the next morning, the trouble started. It began at the rifle range where Mercer had set up an intermediate qualification stage, 800 meters of stage every man in the class could pass. Sarah was on the line, settled behind her rifle, when Doyle walked up and crouched beside her. Mitchell, his voice was low, meant only for her. I need to talk to you. Not here. After. She didn't take her eye off the scope. About what, Sergeant? About Echo 7. A pause. About what the colonel's doing. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, gone rough around the edges. I've been carrying this for 6 weeks and I can't do it anymore. Meet me behind the equipment bay at 2000, come alone. And then he was gone, moving down the line to the next shooter, and Sarah lay there behind her rifle with her heart going a little faster, because Sergeant Doyle had been Mercer's man from the first day, the instrument of every unfair route and every red mark on her card. And now he wanted to talk in the dark where no one could see. That night she went. Doyle was waiting in the shadows behind the equipment bay, and in the low light, Sarah could see he hadn't slept. There was a haggard, hollowed-out look to him, the look of a man wrestling with something heavy. I'm going to lose my career for this, he said without preamble. Maybe worse. But I've been a soldier for 19 years, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks, I stopped recognizing the man I see in the mirror. He took a breath. What we did to you, the roots, the scores, that wasn't a qualification, Mitchell. That was a hit job. And I ran it. I want you to hear me say that. I ran it, and I'm ashamed. Sarah said nothing. She'd learned that the truth comes out faster when you don't reach for it. The colonel doesn't want you to fail Echo 7 because it's the standard, Doyle went on. He keeps saying that the standard like it's about fairness. It's not. I've seen his service record. I've seen things in his file that aren't supposed to be in mine to see. He looked at her hard. 20 years ago, there was a selection course. A woman went through it. Mercer was there. Something happened, something bad, and that woman never recovered. And I think it broke something in him too. I don't know the whole story, but I know this isn't about you. You just walked into a war that started 2 decades before you ever put on a uniform. Sarah felt the pieces start to move in her head, but she kept her voice even. Why are you telling me this, Doyle? Because he's not going to stop at Echo 7. Doyle stepped closer. I overheard him on the phone tonight. If you somehow pass that target, if you do the impossible, he's already got the next thing lined up. A safety violation, a fabricated one. He's going to claim you swept your muzzle across another candidate during the live fire stage. That's an automatic expulsion, Mitchell. No appeal. He's got 2 instructors who'll swear they saw it. His jaw worked. He's going to fail you on Echo 7 if he can. And if he can't, he's going to lie you out of the program. There is no version of this where he lets you graduate. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the size of the thing standing in front of you. The desert was silent around them. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and another answered. Why risk your career to warn me? Sarah asked quietly. You don't even like me. Doyle was quiet a long moment. My daughter's 14, he finally said. She wants to fly fighters. Wants it so bad, she's got pictures of F-35s all over her bedroom wall. His voice cracked just slightly. And 6 weeks ago, I'd have told her to go for it. Now I lie awake wondering what kind of Mercer is going to be standing at the front of her formation someday, deciding she doesn't belong before she said a word. He shook his head. I helped him do this to you. I won't be the reason somebody does it to her. That's why. Sarah looked at this man, this instrument of her torment, standing in the dark, choosing to throw away everything to do one decent thing, and she felt something shift in her chest. Thank you, Sergeant, she said. I mean that. Don't thank me. I'm the villain in this story, same as him. I'm just a villain who finally got tired of his own face. He turned to go, then stopped. Mitchell, Echo 7, tell me straight, is there any chance at all you make that shot? Sarah thought about her notebook, about the hawk riding the currents, about the door in the wind that opened and closed every few minutes like a heartbeat. And she made a decision to keep that secret a little longer because in a war like this, knowing something your enemy didn't was the only real weapon she had. There's always a chance, Sergeant, she said. The wind doesn't lie, people do. She walked back to the bunkhouse alone and her mind was racing now. Working the problem from every angle, Mercer had a backup plan. A fabricated safety violation, 2 instructors ready to perjure themselves, an automatic expulsion with no appeal. Hitting Echo 7 wasn't going to be enough. She could make the impossible shot in front of God and the whole United States military, and Mercer would simply move to the next lie. She wasn't fighting a target. She was fighting a man who had decided 20 years before she was born into this fight that women like her had to be stopped, and who had the authority to bend the entire system around that obsession. She needed more than a perfect shot. She needed witnesses he couldn't buy and evidence he couldn't bury. The next morning, she found Tyler Brooks at breakfast and sat down across from him. Brooks, your phone, does it shoot video? He blinked. Course it does. Why? Because in 2 days, I'm going to do something nobody's done in 30 years, and there's a man who's going to spend the rest of his career swearing it didn't happen the way it happened. She leaned in. I need it recorded every second, not on his cameras, on yours, and I need you to send it somewhere safe the second it's done. Can you do that for me? Brooks looked at her, and something fierce came into his young face, something that had been growing in him for 6 weeks, Sarah, he said. After what you did for me, after you fixed my head, when nobody else even looked at me twice, I do a whole lot more than hold up a phone. He nodded once hard. I'm in, whatever it is I'm in. And across the chow hall, neither of them noticed Colonel Jack Mercer standing in the doorway, watching the two of them lean close in quiet conversation. His eyes narrowing his mind, already working out what kind of threat a friendship like that might pose to a war he'd been fighting in secret for 20 years. That afternoon, Mercer pulled Sarah aside as the candidates filed off the range. He waited until they were alone, until there were no witnesses, and then he stepped close enough that she could see the gray stubble on his jaw and the cold certainty in his eyes. I know you've been climbing that ridge at night, he said softly. Doyle reports to me, Mitchell. Whatever you think you figured out up there, whatever little secret you think you found in that canyon, it won't matter. You could be the greatest shooter who ever lived, and it wouldn't matter. Because I decide who graduates this program. Not the target, not your numbers, me. He smiled thin and humorless. You should have quit on day 1. It would have hurt less. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she let him see something other than calm. She let him see a flicker of the steel underneath. You keep telling me what I should have done, Colonel, she said, day after day like a man trying to convince himself. But you've never once asked yourself the only question that actually matters. She held his gaze. You ever wonder why a sniper stays quiet for 6 weeks while you do everything in your power to break her? Why she takes every unfair route and every rigged score and never says a single word? Mercer's smile faltered just slightly. Why? Because a sniper learned a long time ago, Sarah said, that you don't waste your shot on the wind. You wait. You stay still. You let the target think it's safe. And then when the moment's exactly right, you take one shot and you make it count. She picked up her rifle case and slung it over her shoulder. I've been waiting 6 weeks, Colonel. The wind's about to change. And when it does, you're going to wish you'd never thrown my father's rifle on that ground. She walked him away and left him standing there in the dying light. And for the first time since the convoy had rolled into Nevada, it was Colonel Jack Mercer who didn't have anything to say. He watched her go, this woman he'd been so certain he could break. And somewhere deep in his chest, a cold thread of doubt began to pull loose, the first he'd felt in 20 years. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he held all the cards, the target, the scores, the fabricated violation, the 2 instructors ready to lie. He told himself that in 48 hours, this would be over, and Sarah Mitchell would be on a transport back to wherever the Army had dug her up, and the program would go on the way it always had. But that night, Colonel Mercer didn't sleep either. And on the ridge above the canyon, lying on her belly in the cold with her father's photograph in her breast pocket and her notebook open in front of her, Sarah Mitchell watched the door into the wind, open and close, steady as a heartbeat, and she counted the seconds, and she waited for the day she would finally take her shot. The morning before the final qualification, everything that could go wrong began to go wrong, and it started before the sun was fully up. Sarah woke at 0400, the way she always did, reached into her breast pocket for her father's photograph the way she always did, and her fingers closed on nothing. She sat up fast. She checked the floor, the bunk, the seam of her sleeping bag. The photograph was gone, and so was her notebook. The notebook with 3 nights of wind cycles timed to the second, the notebook that held the only thing standing between her and a target nobody had touched in 30 years, both of them. Gone in the night. She knew immediately who'd taken them, and she knew exactly why. She found Doyle at the coffee urn before formation, pulled him aside and kept her voice low. He came into my quarters last night, took my notebook and my father's picture. Doyle's face went pale. Mitchell, I swear to you, I didn't tell him you. I know you didn't. She believed him. She'd watched enough men lie to know what the truth looked like on a face, and Doyle wasn't lying. He's not trying to find out what I learned. He already knows. I figured the canyon out. He told me so himself. He took the notebook so I can't review it. And he took my father's photograph because he wants me rattled. He wants me standing on that line today with my heart breaking instead of my head working. She exhaled slow. He's smarter than I gave him credit for. What are you going to do? Sarah looked out across the camp toward the canyon, gray and silent in the early light. I memorized the cycles, Doyle, every one. The notebook was just insurance. She turned back to him. But the photograph, that one he gets to keep for now. Because if I let him see how bad it hurts, he wins the only fight that matters today, the one inside my own skull. But Mercer wasn't finished. He'd only just begun. At formation, the colonel announced a change to the day's order. The candidates would shoot Echo 7 in reverse rank, order lowest scores, first, highest, last. It sounded fair. It sounded like nothing. But Sarah had the top score in the class despite 6 weeks of sabotage, which meant she would shoot dead last, which meant she would stand on that line for hours in the rising heat, watching 41 elite operators miss the impossible shot one after another, her nerves grinding down with every clang of a bullet hitting nothing but canyon rock. It was psychological warfare disguised as procedure. Make her wait, make her watch everyone fail. Let the impossibility of the thing sink into her bones until she half believed it herself. Clever, Sarah murmured under her breath. Real clever, Colonel. The shooting began at 0700. The first candidate was a Marine named Vasquez, a good shooter. Steady hands, 2 combat tours. He settled on the line, took his time, and fired. The bullet sailed across the canyon and vanished into the rock face a full 2 meters left of Echo 7. He fired again, wide right. A third time, short. He stood up after 3 attempts with his jaw clenched and his ears red, and he walked off the line without a word. And the silence that followed him told Sarah everything about how badly that target wrecked a man's pride. The second candidate failed. The third, the fourth. By mid-morning, 11 of America's finest snipers had stood on that line, and 11 had missed, and the canyon floor was littered with the ghosts of their bullets. The heat was climbing now, the shimmer thickening over the rock, and Sarah stood at the back of the line in the sun and made herself breathe slow and watch the hawk. Because the hawk had come back, Same time, same canyon riding the same currents, and as Sarah watched it set its wings and rise without a single flap of effort, she counted in her head and she felt the rhythm of the door in the wind opening and closing exactly as her notebook had told her it would. The cycles hadn't changed. Mercer could take her notebook, but he couldn't take the canyon's heartbeat. It was still there. She just had to feel it instead of read it. Around noon, Tyler Brooks took his turn. Sarah watched him walk to the line and she saw the old fear creeping back into his shoulders, the same fear she diagnosed in the equipment bay weeks ago. He settled behind the rifle and she could see his breathing go shallow and quick from 40 feet away. He was going to flinch. He was going to talk himself into missing before he ever touched the trigger. Brooks, she called out, breaking line protocol, not caring. Doyle started to bark at her and then stopped himself. Brooks, listen to me. You're not going to hit it. Nobody is not without 3 nights on that ridge, so stop trying to hit it. Brooks turned his head confused. Just make a clean shot, a textbook shot. Forget the steel. Show me the soldier I taught. Breathe, settle, squeeze. That's all. Show me. And something in Brooks's shoulders loosened. He turned back to the rifle and Sarah watched him breathe, really breathe. This time watched the tension drain out of his frame, and he squeezed off a shot that was textbook perfect in every way except that it missed Echo 7 by half a meter. Closest anyone had come all morning. He stood up, and he wasn't ashamed. He looked over at Sarah and he grinned, because for the first time in his career, Tyler Brooks had taken a hard shot and not been afraid. And that was worth more to him than steel. Did you see that? He said, jogging back. Half a meter, Sarah. Half a meter on the impossible shot. I saw it. She gripped his shoulder. That's the man I knew was in there. But across the line, Colonel Mercer had seen it too, and Mercer wasn't smiling. The afternoon wore on. More shooters, more misses. The sun crawled across the sky and the heat became a living thing. And one by one, the legend of Echo 7 added new names to its list of the defeated. By 1500 hours, 40 candidates had failed. 40 out of 41. Only Sarah Mitchell remained, and that was when Mercer made his move. He walked over to where Sarah waited, and Doyle drifted close behind him, and the colonel had a strange light in his eyes now, the look of a man playing what he believed was his winning card. Mitchell, he said loud enough for the nearest candidates to hear, before you take your turn, I'm informing you of a safety report filed this morning. During yesterday's live fire stage, 2 instructors observed you sweep your muzzle across candidate Brooks. That's a flagrant safety violation. Automatic expulsion. He smiled. You can take your shot at Echo 7 if you like, but it changes nothing. You're done. You were done before you ever walked to this line. The candidates went still. Brooks's head snapped up. That's a lie, he said, stepping forward, his voice cracking with anger. I was right next to her the whole stage. She never swept anybody. That never happened, Colonel, and you know it. 2 instructors say otherwise, son, Mercer said without looking at him, and their word outranks yours. This was the moment Mercer had built for weeks. The trap inside the trap. Even if she made the impossible shot, he had the lie ready, the perjured witnesses, the automatic expulsion. He'd told Doyle there was no version where she graduated, and now he was making it true right here in front of everyone. But Sarah Mitchell didn't flinch. She'd known this was coming. Doyle had warned her in the dark behind the equipment bay, and she'd spent the last 2 days getting ready for it. 2 instructors, she said calmly. Would those be Sergeant Coleman and Sergeant Pike? Colonel Mercer's smile flickered. How did you? Because they're the only 2 who weren't on the firing line during yesterday's stage. The only 2 who could claim to have been watching from an angle. She let that hang. Funny thing about a live fire range, Colonel. There are cameras everywhere, safety cameras. Yours. They record every stage, every shooter, every muzzle. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to pull the footage from yesterday's stage and play it for everyone standing here. And if it shows me sweeping my muzzle across Brooks, I'll pack my bags and walk out of this desert, and you'll never hear from me again. She took 1 step closer. But if it doesn't, you're going to stand here in front of 41 witnesses and explain how 2 of your instructors came to file a sworn report about something the cameras say never happened. The silence was total. Mercer's face had gone gray because the cameras did exist. They recorded everything. And he had been so focused on building his lie that he'd forgotten the one thing a man building a lie can never afford to forget, that the truth is usually written down somewhere waiting. The footage isn't available, Mercer said, and for the first time his voice wasn't steady. It's available, Doyle said. Every head turned. Sergeant Doyle had stepped forward and his face was set like stone, a man who had finally decided which side of the line he was going to die on. The safety footage is in the system, Colonel. I can pull it in 5 minutes, all of it. He looked at Mercer and 19 years of obedience finished cracking apart right there in the desert heat. I think we should all watch it, don't you? It was a mutiny, plain and simple, and everyone knew it. Doyle had just ended his career standing in the sun, and he'd done it on purpose, and his face said he'd never felt cleaner in his life. Mercer looked at Doyle, then at the candidates, 41 men who were no longer looking at Sarah Mitchell like she was a problem, but looking at their colonel like they were seeing him clearly for the first time. And Mercer understood in that moment that the safety violation was dead. He couldn't run the lie, not with the footage in the system and Doyle willing to pull it and 41 witnesses standing there waiting. Withdraw the report, Sarah said quietly. Withdraw it now in front of everyone and we'll forget it ever existed. Or pull the footage. Your choice, Colonel, but you're going to make it right now. The seconds stretched out. A muscle jumped in Mercer's jaw, and then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The report is withdrawn." A breath went through the assembled candidates, something between shock and satisfaction. Louder, Colonel, Brooks said, so everybody hears it. Mercer's eyes blazed, but he was cornered, and he knew it. The report is withdrawn, he said louder this time, the words like broken glass in his mouth. It was filed in error. Sarah nodded once. Thank you. And just like that, the trap inside the trap collapsed. Mercer had played his winning card, and Sarah had been holding the answer to it for 2 days, because a sergeant with a 14-year-old daughter had chosen somewhere in the dark to stop being a villain. Mercer had counted on Doyle's loyalty. He'd never imagined that the man he'd used as an instrument might turn into the thing that broke him. But the day wasn't over. There was still the target. There was still Echo 7. Now, Sarah said, turning toward the firing line, lifting her rifle. If you'll excuse me, Colonel, I've got a shot to take. She walked to the line and the entire camp fell silent behind her 41 men and 2 instructors and 1 colonel, all of them watching the only person who'd refused to fail. And as she settled onto her belly behind the rifle, Brooks quietly slipped his phone from his pocket, raised it, and began to record, just like she'd asked. Whatever happened next, it would exist somewhere Mercer couldn't reach. But Mercer had 1 card left. One last cruelty. As Sarah settled behind her scope, he walked up behind her, and he crouched down close, and he spoke so only she could hear. Your father's photograph, he murmured. The one I took last night. I've got it right here in my pocket. And I want you to know something, Mitchell. Your daddy's been dead 2 years. And the last thing his picture's going to see is his little girl missing the same shot that's beaten every real soldier who ever stood on this line. He's going to watch you fail. Think about that while you're aiming. It was the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to her. It was designed to do exactly one thing, to put grief and rage into her hands at the precise moment she needed them empty and still. A shooter who's angry, a shooter who's grieving, a shooter whose heart is pounding with fury that shooter misses. Mercer knew it. He'd spent 30 years on these lines. He knew that the surest way to make a great shooter miss was to fill them up with feeling at the moment of the squeeze. And for 1 second, it almost worked. Sarah felt the heat rise in her chest, felt her hands want to tremble, felt the grief and the anger surge up together like a wave. And then she heard her father's voice, clear as the Montana wind, the way she'd heard it 10,000 times since she was 9 years old. The wind doesn't care if you're scared or proud or angry, Sarah. The wind only cares whether you understand it. She closed her eyes. She let the wave crest and break and roll back out. She put the grief somewhere safe the way she'd learned to put everything somewhere safe, and when she opened her eyes again behind that scope, she was empty and still and clear as glass. You can keep the photograph, Colonel, she said softly, not turning around. Because my father's not in that picture. My father's right here. She tapped the side of her head once gently. He's been here the whole time, and he's not the slightest bit worried. She put her eye to the scope. 1,500 meters out, Echo 7 sat dark and small against the rock, the target that had humbled a generation of warriors, the legend, the impossible. And across the canyon, the thermals rose and fell, and somewhere in that invisible churning, the door in the wind was opening and closing, steady as a heartbeat. Sarah Mitchell settled into the rifle. She slowed her breathing until each breath took 6 full seconds. She found the hawk in the corner of her scope riding the currents, and she used it like a flag, watching where it rose and where it sank, reading the canyon, the way her father had taught her to read the wind off a Montana ridge. And she began to count. Behind her, Brooks held the phone steady and didn't breathe. Doyle stood with his fists clenched. 40 candidates watched in dead silence, and Colonel Jack Mercer stood frozen behind her with her father's photograph in his pocket and a cold dread spreading through his chest, because he was watching the way she moved, the absolute stillness of her, the way she wasn't aiming at the target at all, but seemed to be listening to something none of them could hear. And for the first time in 30 years on these lines, Colonel Mercer saw a shooter who didn't look like she was about to fail. She looked like she was about to make history. Sarah counted the cycle down. The thermal column was rising now, pushing the crosswind up and out, building toward its peak. In a few seconds, it would collapse. In a few seconds, the wind across that canyon would go still for 4 seconds, maybe 5, the door swinging open exactly the way it had every night she'd lain on that ridge. She took up the slack in the trigger. She waited. The hawk dipped. The shimmer changed. The dust on the canyon floor settled flat. The door began to open. And Sarah Mitchell let out half a breath, held the rest, and put her father, her grief, her rage, the colonel, the 41 men, the 30 years of failure, the entire screaming weight of the moment, somewhere far away and silent, until there was nothing left in the whole world but a small, dark rectangle of steel 1,500 meters away, and a window in the wind that was opening almost open now. And her finger tightened on the trigger. And then at the last possible instant, Sarah Mitchell did not fire. She eased off the trigger. She let the breath go, and 41 men who had been holding their own breath made a sound somewhere between confusion and disbelief, because the window had been right there, the wind had gone, still the door had opened, and she had let it close again untouched. Behind her, Mercer let out a short, ugly laugh. "I knew it," he said. She froze. She had it, and she froze. They all freeze in the end. But Sarah hadn't frozen. Doyle, watching her, understood it before anyone else did. She'd let that window pass on purpose, because she'd felt something in it, something half a beat off the thermal collapsing just a fraction early, and a shooter who takes a shot through a door that's already starting to swing shut is a shooter who misses by half a meter. Like Brooks, like the closest anyone had ever come. Sarah wasn't here to come close. She'd waited 6 weeks. She could wait one more cycle. She didn't freeze, Doyle said quietly, mostly to himself. She passed on it. She's waiting for a clean one. Brooks heard him and his hands tightened on the phone and he kept recording. Sarah breathed. She found the hawk again. She let the canyon talk to her and she counted the next cycle down from its peak, feeling the column rise, feeling it build, feeling it crest. 40 seconds passed. The men around her had gone rigid with the agony of it, the not knowing, the waiting. Mercer's smug certainty was already curdling because she hadn't packed up and quit the way a frozen shooter quits. She was still down behind that rifle, still breathing slow, still listening to something none of them could hear. 10 seconds, Sarah whispered to no one. The thermal column reached its peak. She felt it the way you feel a wave lift you just before it sets you down. The crosswind pushed up and out, climbing. 20 seconds. And then it began to fall. The column collapsed smooth, and even this time no early stutter, no half beat off. The dust on the canyon floor settled flat and stayed flat. The shimmer steadied, and the hawk 1,500 meters out set its wings and held perfectly level, riding a current that had gone calm. The door swung open. 30 seconds. Sarah breathed, and this time the breath she let out was the one that mattered. Half out, hold the rest, empty the world. There was no Mercer, no photograph in his pocket, no 41 men, no 30 years of failure, no grief for a father 2 years in the Montana ground. There was no Sarah Mitchell either, not really, just a pair of eyes in a steel rectangle 1,500 meters away, and a window in the wind standing wide and still and open. Her finger came back slow and smooth, the way her daddy taught her when she was 9 years old and could barely hold the rifle steady, slow and smooth. So the rifle doesn't know the shot's coming until it's already gone. The rifle fired. The sound cracked across the canyon and rolled out into the desert, and the bullet vanished, swallowed by 1,500 meters of empty air. And then there was nothing. Nothing but silence in the wind and 41 men leaning forward waiting, because a bullet takes almost 2 full seconds to cross a gap that wide, and those 2 seconds stretched out into something that felt like the rest of all their lives. 1 second, the hawk drifted across the canyon oblivious. 2 seconds. And then faint and clear and unmistakable, carried back across 1,500 meters of Nevada air came a single sound, clang. For 1 full second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody believed it. 41 of America's finest snipers stood frozen in the desert heat, certain their ears had lied to them because that sound, that flat ringing clang of a bullet striking steel dead center was a sound that had not been heard at Echo 7 in 30 years. It was a sound that, by everything they'd ever been told, by everything the legend insisted was not supposed to exist. Doyle was the first to break. He grabbed the spotting scope off the table with shaking hands and put it to his eye, and found the target across the canyon, and he stared and his mouth fell open and the scope trembled in his grip. Center, he said, his voice cracked. He said it again louder, turning to the candidate's tears standing in his eyes. Dead center, she hit it. She hit Echo 7. Dead center, you understand me, 30 years. 30 years, and she hit it dead center. The canyon exploded. 41 men who had spent 6 weeks doubting her, mocking her, waiting for her to quit, came apart all at once. Vasquez was shouting something nobody could make out. 2 Rangers were pounding each other on the back. Somebody was just yelling a wordless roar of pure disbelief, and Brooks, sweet terrified Brooks, who'd learned to shoot without fear because of her, was on his knees in the dirt with the phone still held high and steady in one hand, and the other hand pressed over his mouth, crying openly and not caring who saw. She did it, Brooks kept saying. She did it, oh my God, she did it. And in the middle of all of it, Sarah Mitchell lay perfectly still behind her rifle. She didn't leap up. She didn't shout. She didn't turn to gloat at the colonel who'd thrown her father's rifle on the ground 6 weeks ago. She just lay there with her cheek still against the stock and her eye still to the scope, looking at the small, dark rectangle of steel she'd just made history against, and a single tear ran down the side of her nose and dropped into the Nevada dust, and her lips moved, and only the rifle heard what she said. We did it, Daddy. Then she safed the weapon the way she'd been trained, the way she always did, no matter what, and only then did she rise to her feet. The men fell silent as she stood. One by one they quieted until 41 of America's most elite warriors stood looking at a 34-year-old woman from Montana in something that had passed all the way through respect and come out the other side into something closer to awe. And then Vasquez, the Marine who'd missed first thing that morning, the one who'd walked off the line with his ears burning, snapped to attention and brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate salute. And then they all did. 41 men, every single one of them, came to attention and saluted her there in the desert heat. And it was not a salute of rank because she didn't outrank most of them. It was something older and truer than rank. It was the salute warriors give to someone who has done the impossible in front of their own eyes and burned away every doubt they ever carried. Sarah looked at them and her throat worked, and she returned the salute, and for once in her life, she let them see exactly what it cost her. The tears she didn't bother to hide now because these were her brothers. Now every one of them, and they knew it, and she knew it. But there was one man who hadn't moved. Colonel Jack Mercer stood off to the side alone. Her father's photograph still in his pocket, and on his face was an expression Doyle had never seen there in all the years he'd served under him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even the cold certainty he'd worn like armor since the first day at Coronado. It was the face of a man whose entire world had just been proven wrong in a single flat ringing clang of steel. Mercer had built his life on a belief. He'd told himself it was about standards. He'd told himself it was about protecting the program, protecting the mission, protecting people from limits they couldn't see. And in 2 seconds, in the time it took a bullet to cross a canyon, that belief had shattered, and there was nothing underneath it but a man standing alone in the desert holding a dead man's photograph and not understanding anymore who he was. The candidates were still celebrating, swarming towards Sarah, and in the chaos, Mercer turned almost stumbling and walked away from the line, away from all of it, out toward the edge of the canyon, where the ground dropped away into the gap she'd just shot across. He walked like a man who'd been struck, and he stopped at the edge, and he stood there alone, with his back to all of them, staring out at the impossible thing that had just become possible. Doyle moved to follow him. Sarah caught his arm. No, she said quietly. Leave him. I'll go. Mitchell, after everything he did to you. I know what he did. She looked toward the lonely figure at the canyon's edge. But you don't beat a man like that by being cruel to him in the 1 minute his whole world fell apart. You beat him by being right. And I've already done that part. She handed Doyle her rifle. Hold this, and Brooks. She turned. Send the video, right now, don't wait. Brooks nodded and bent over the phone, and Sarah Mitchell walked alone across the firing line past 41 men who fell quiet and parted to let her pass out toward the colonel standing at the edge of the canyon. The clock read 15:47, 11 days since he'd smashed her father's rifle on the Coronado concrete. And now she walked toward him not as a beaten woman, but as the only person alive who had ever done the thing he'd built his certainty around being impossible. She stopped beside him at the canyon's edge. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, the same wind she'd just read better than any man in 30 years. How, Mercer finally said. His voice was hollow. He didn't look at her. 30 years, Mitchell. 30 years, and the best shooters this country ever produced couldn't touch it. How did you do it? Because they treated it like a target, Sarah said. And it's not a target, it's a system. The thermals aren't random, Colonel. They never were. They run on a cycle, about a 4-minute cycle. And at the bottom of every cycle, there's a window 4 or 5 seconds where the wind across that canyon goes dead still. Nobody ever found it because nobody ever bothered to look. They got their one day and their one briefing, and they treated it like a coin flip. She paused. I spent 3 nights up on that ridge learning the wind. That's the whole secret. That's all it ever was. Somebody just had to care enough to watch. Mercer was quiet a long time. When he spoke again, something had broken loose in his voice. I had your notebook, he said. I took it. The wind cycles. I read it last night by flashlight, and I didn't even understand what I was looking at. A bitter sound, half a laugh. I had the answer in my own hands, and I couldn't see it. You memorized it. You did it from memory. I did. He reached into his pocket slowly, and he drew out the photograph. Her father, standing in front of that Montana barn rifle broken open over his forearm, squinting into the setting sun. Mercer looked at it for a long moment. Then he held it out to her. I'm sorry, he said, and the 2 words came out of him like they cost everything he had left. Not for the course. I'll answer for the course, the routes, the scores, the report I filed this morning. There'll be a board. I'll stand in front of it and tell the truth. He swallowed. I'm sorry for this, for taking him. A man shouldn't use a person's grief as a weapon. I knew better. I did it anyway. And I'm ashamed. Sarah took the photograph from his hand. She looked down at her father's face, and then she carefully tucked it back into her breast pocket over her heart where it belonged. Why, she asked. It was the question she'd carried for 6 weeks, the one Doyle had hinted at in the dark behind the equipment bay. Why me, Colonel? You didn't even know me. I saw you. The first second I stepped off that bus, you'd already decided to destroy me. A man doesn't hate a stranger that hard for no reason. So why? Mercer's jaw worked. He looked out across the canyon for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was the voice of a man pulling something up from 20 years down. Because I watched it kill someone once, he said. A long time ago, a selection course, not this one, but like it. And there was someone in it who wanted it as bad as you do. Wanted it more than anything. His hands had begun to shake. And the pressure broke her. Not her body, her mind. She had a collapse on that course that she never came back from. Not all the way, not ever. And I stood there and watched it happen, and I told myself afterward that the kindest thing, the only decent thing, was to make sure no one like her ever got close to a course like this again, that I was protecting them. He turned finally and looked at Sarah, and his eyes were wet. I told myself that for 20 years. Sarah felt the pieces fall into place. Who was she? Mercer's face crumpled just for an instant before he forced it still again. My sister, he said. And there it was, the thing underneath the thing. The wound he'd been pressing on for 20 years until it turned into the cruelty that had nearly ended her. Sarah stood there at the edge of the canyon and felt her anger drain away, not because what he'd done was forgivable. Not yet, but because she finally understood it wasn't about her at all. It had never been about her. She just walked into a grief 2 decades old and worn the face of the person he'd spent his whole life trying to save. You weren't protecting her, Sarah said gently, and you weren't protecting them. You were deciding their limits for them. You took the thing that happened to one person and you turned it into a wall, and you stood at that wall for 20 years keeping everyone out, and you called it kindness. She shook her head. But it wasn't kindness, Colonel. It was fear wearing kindness like a uniform. Your sister didn't break because she didn't belong. She broke because somebody pushed her past what any human being could hold and called it a standard. Standard, the way you tried to push me. She held his gaze. The difference is I had 3 nights on a ridge and a man who taught me how to breathe. She had no one. That's not a reason to keep the next woman out. That's a reason to make sure the next woman has what your sister didn't. Mercer stared at her, and something in his face came apart, 20 years of certainty collapsing all at once. And this time he didn't fight it. I was wrong, he whispered. God help me, I was wrong about all of it. Yeah, Sarah said, not a cruel, just true. You were. Behind them at the firing line, Brooks straightened up from his phone and he looked toward the 2 figures at the canyon's edge. And he said quietly to Doyle, it's sent, the video's out, 3 different places. Nobody can bury it now. Doyle nodded slowly, watching Sarah and the colonel standing together against the vast empty canyon. Doesn't matter anymore, he said. Look at them, he's not trying to bury anything now. That's a man who just lost a war he's been fighting his whole life. He paused. And the strange thing is, I think losing it might be the best thing that ever happened to him. The sun was beginning to drop toward the western rim of the canyon, throwing long gold light across the desert. And Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the gap she'd just conquered with her father's photograph over her heart. And Colonel Jack Mercer stood beside her. And for the first time since the convoy had rolled into Nevada, there was no war between them. Just 2 people in a canyon and a wind that didn't care who either of them was, a wind that only cared the way her father always said, whether you understood it. And Sarah Mitchell understood it now better than anyone alive. The video reached the Pentagon before the convoy ever left Nevada. Brooks had sent it to 3 places, and one of those places was a retired master sergeant he'd served under a man who knew a colonel 2 doors down from the office that oversaw the entire Joint Special Operations Training Command. By this time the trucks rolled back through the gates of Coronado 2 days after the shot, the footage of Sarah Mitchell hitting Echo 7 dead center had been watched by people whose names did not appear in any directory. And it had been watched alongside a second piece of footage Brooks had captured without anyone knowing, the audio of Colonel Jack Mercer announcing a safety violation that the range cameras proved had never happened. Sarah didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that the morning after they got back, a sergeant she'd never seen before knocked on the frame of her partition quarters and told her that a review board had been convened and that her presence was required and that she should bring everything she had. She walked into that room expecting to defend herself one last time. She'd done it her whole career. She'd learned to walk into rooms full of men who'd already decided who she was, and she'd squared her shoulders and done it again. But this room was different. There were 3 general officers at the table, 2 men and a woman, and the woman was a 2-star whose nameplate read Reyes. And when Sarah came to attention, General Reyes looked up at her and did something Sarah had not been prepared for at all. She stood, and the other 2 generals stood with her. Chief Mitchell, General Reyes said, we've watched the footage, all of it. Sit down, please. You're not here to defend anything. You're here because we owe you some answers, and because there are some decisions to be made, and you've earned a voice in every one of them. Sarah sat, her heart was pounding, but she kept her face still the way she always did. Let's start with the simple part, Reyes said. Your record in the course. 6 weeks of extended route single attempts where other candidates got multiple scoring discrepancies we can document on nearly every stage. We've recalculated your scores using the standard rubric applied to every other candidate. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Under fair scoring with the conditions you were actually shooting in, you didn't just pass. You posted the highest aggregate score in the recorded history of this program, higher than anyone, ever. Sarah looked down at the number on the page, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The Echo 7 shot is its own matter, Reyes continued. We've had instructors review the footage frame by frame. The methodology you used, the thermal cycle, the timing window. The WinRed, it's being written up right now as formal doctrine. Within the year, every sniper school in the country is going to teach the technique. They're calling it the Mitchell window. A small smile. You didn't just hit the impossible shot, Chief. You made it possible for everyone who comes after you. That target's going to fall a lot more often now because of you. Brooks, waiting outside that room, would later say he'd never seen Sarah Mitchell's hands shake until she walked out of it. Inside, she held them flat on her thighs and held herself together by force of will. Now the hard part, Reyes, and her voice changed. Colonel Jack Mercer. The room went quiet. The safety report he filed against you constitutes attempted fraud, and given the perjured statements of two instructors, he solicited conspiracy. That's a court-martial offense. Career ending at minimum. Potentially prison. Reyes folded her hands. Sergeant Coleman and Sergeant Pike have both already confessed. They've stated on the record that the colonel instructed them to file false statements. The case against him is airtight. She paused. And Mercer himself has declined to mount any defense. He submitted a full written confession. Every route, every score, the notebook he stole, your father's photograph, all of it in his own words with no excuses. She looked at Sarah carefully. Which brings us to why you're here. Before this board decides his fate, the man you wronged the most has asked to hear from the woman he wronged. The victim's statement carries weight, Chief, so I'll ask you plainly. What do you want us to do with Colonel Jack Mercer? And there it was, the question Sarah had not seen coming. They were handing her the man who'd thrown her father's rifle on the concrete, who'd tried to break her for 6 weeks, who'd stolen her father's photograph, and used her grief as a weapon at the exact moment she needed to be empty. They were handing him to her, and whatever she said in this room would decide the rest of his life. For a long moment, Sarah didn't answer. She thought about the canyon, about a man standing alone at the edge of it with 20 years of certainty crumbling under his feet. She thought about a sister who'd broken on a course like this one and never come all the way back, and a brother who'd turned his grief into a wall and called it kindness. She thought about what it does to a person to be wrong about the one thing they built their whole life around, and to find out in front of everyone in 2 seconds, in the flat ringing clang of a bullet on steel. Can I ask the board a question first? Sarah said. Reyes nodded. Go ahead. His sister. Sarah's voice was steady. 20 years ago, the selection course she broke on, was there a review? Did anybody ever look at what that course was doing to people? Or did they just write her off as someone who didn't belong and move on? The three generals exchanged glances. The older of the two men spoke for the first time, a grizzled 3-star named Hollis. There was no review, he said quietly. In those days, there never was. A candidate broke, they were gone, and nobody asked why. We've changed a great deal since then, but not in time for her. No, he paused. How did you know to ask that? Because that's the whole story, isn't it? Sarah said. A woman gets pushed past what anybody could hold breaks, and instead of fixing the thing that broke her, the system decides the problem was her. And her brother spent 20 years believing the same lie the system told him, that she was the flaw, not the course. That's why he came after me. He wasn't trying to destroy me. He was trying to save a ghost. She looked at Reyes. If you court-martial him and send him to prison, you punish a man for being broken by a thing the army did to his family and never answered for. And nothing changes. 20 years from now, there's another Mercer made the same way, doing the same thing to another woman. So you're asking us to let him go, Reyes said carefully. No. Sarah's voice went hard. What he did to me was wrong, and there has to be a consequence, or it means nothing. A man can't use a person's dead father against them and walk away clean. But there's a difference between a consequence that heals something and a consequence that just breaks one more person. She leaned forward. Don't send him to prison. Take his command. He's done leading candidates, and he knows it, and he agrees. But don't throw him away. Make him build the thing he should have built 20 years ago. Make him stand up the program that reviews what these courses actually do to the people in them. The mental load, the psychological pressure, the line between a hard standard and a thing that just destroys people for no reason. Make him spend the rest of his career making sure no one ever breaks the way his sister broke, and no one ever gets pushed the way I got pushed. She sat back. That's not mercy. That's a sentence. The hardest one there is. Make him fix it every day for the rest of his life. The room was silent for a long time. General Reyes looked at the woman across the table from her, and something moved behind her eyes. Something that might have been recognition. The look of one woman who'd fought her own wars, seeing another who'd fought harder ones and come out wiser. In 30 years of service, Reyes said quietly, I have never once heard a victim ask us to turn the man who wronged them into something useful, instead of something destroyed. She glanced at the other two generals, and both of them gave a small nod. We'll take it under advisement, Chief. But I'll tell you honestly, I think that's exactly what we're going to do. Sarah Mitchell graduated from the Joint Special Operations Sniper Qualification 11 days later as the highest scoring sniper in the recorded history of the program. There was no ceremony at first, just a list posted on a board, and her name at the top of it, and 40 other names below hers, and one name, Brooks Tyler, that she'd made sure stayed on the list when an early draft had quietly dropped him. But the men wouldn't let it go without a ceremony. They organized one themselves. And when Sarah walked out onto that same Coronado field where Colonel Mercer had thrown her file on the wet pavement 6 weeks before and told her she didn't belong, 41 men stood waiting for her in dress formation, and they came to attention as one, and they saluted her. And this time it wasn't shock or awe behind it. It was brotherhood. It was the thing she'd been fighting for since the day she was 9 years old, and her father put a real rifle in her small hands and told her the wind didn't care who she was. The wind had carried her bullet home, and the men knew it. Tyler Brooks found her afterward, and the kid could barely get the words out. I made it because of you, he said. My whole career I shot scared, and I'd have washed out of this course in the first week, and you sat me down in that equipment bay and you fixed something in my head that nobody else even tried to look at. His voice broke. I'm going to be a sniper because a woman everybody told me didn't belong here taught me how to believe in my own hands. I'm never going to forget that, not as long as I live. Sarah gripped him by both shoulders. You made it because you had it in you the whole time, Brooks. I just held up a mirror. Now go be the kind of soldier who holds one up for the next scared kid. That's how you pay me back. That's the only way. Sergeant Doyle was there too, though his future was uncertain. He'd ended his own career in that desert, standing up to Mercer in front of everyone, and he knew it, and he'd made his peace with it. But when General Reyes heard what he'd done, the warning behind the equipment bay, the willingness to pull the footage, the moment he chose the truth over 19 years of obedience, she made sure his record showed it. He didn't lose his career after all. Well, was reassigned to help stand up the very oversight program Sarah had proposed, working alongside of all people the man he'd once served. Because that's what the board decided in the end. Colonel Jack Mercer was relieved of command. He never led another candidate as long as he served. But he was not sent to prison, and he was not thrown away. He was given exactly the sentence Sarah Mitchell had asked them to give him. He spent the rest of his career building the thing that might have saved his sister, traveling from course to course, studying what relentless pressure does to the human mind, drawing the line between a standard that forges people and a cruelty that destroys them, and making sure the difference got written into doctrine. He did it every single day. And those who worked beside him said he did it like a man trying to pay back a debt he knew he could never fully settle, which was exactly the point. The last time Sarah saw him, he sought her out before she shipped to her next assignment. He stood in front of her, this man who'd once thrown her file on the ground, and he didn't have much armor left. I read the recommendation. You agree the board, he said. You could have ended me. You had every right. Instead, you gave me the one thing I never gave anyone. A chance to be more than the worst thing I believed. His voice was rough. Why? Sarah considered him for a moment. Because you taught me something, Colonel, even if you never meant to. You taught me that the most dangerous prison anybody ever sits in is the one they build out of their own fear and call it wisdom. You sat in yours for 20 years. She nodded slowly. I wasn't about to lock you in another one. Go build something. Make it mean something. That's the only apology I'll ever need from you. He nodded, and his eyes were wet, and he came to attention, and he saluted her slow and full. A colonel saluting a chief rank turned upside down by something that mattered more than rank. Sarah returned it, then she picked up her gear and walked away, and she didn't look back because she'd already won the only war that ever needed winning, and there was nothing left in that place that belonged to her. She went home to Montana before reporting to her next post. She drove the old county road out past the barn where her father had taught her to shoot, the same barn in the photograph she carried over her heart, and she walked up the small hill behind the church to the place where they'd buried him 2 years before, where she hadn't made it home in time to say goodbye. She knelt down in the grass beside the headstone, and from her pocket she took the graduation coin, heavy and bright, the coin that said she was the highest scoring sniper in the history of the most brutal program the country had ever built, the coin she'd earned in a desert, against a target nobody had touched in 30 years, and a man who'd tried to break her for 6 weeks. She set it carefully on top of the headstone where the Montana sun could find it.
We did it, Daddy.
She whispered the same words she'd said behind the rifle with her cheek still against the stock and a bullet ringing on steel 1,500 meters away. Just like you taught me, I waited for the wind. I didn't fight it. I understood it. Her voice cracked and she let it, and it carried me home. She stayed there a long while until the sun dropped low and gold across the hills, and the wind moved through the grass around her the way it had moved through that canyon. The same wind, the only thing in this whole world that had never once cared whether she was a man or a woman, only whether she'd done the work to understand it. And she had. She'd done the work since she was 9 years old. That was the whole answer. That was the only answer that had ever mattered. Sarah Mitchell didn't make history because she was the first woman to walk that course. She didn't make history because she proved a colonel wrong, or because 41 men saluted her in a desert, or because her name went up at the top of a list. She made history for one reason, the reason her father had put in her hands before she was old enough to understand it, and the reason every young woman who studies the Mitchell window in sniper schools today comes to learn for herself. The mission never cared who pulled the trigger. It only ever cared whether the shot landed, and hers did, dead center, every single time it counted.